Dodds. I'm the president here at St. Mary's University, and it's with great pleasure I welcome you all to the inaugural annual lecture on ethics in public affairs, presented by the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. CCEPA is, as you probably know, a joint initiative of the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. The intent of this annual lecture is that there will be a presentation by a prominent Canadian on an important ethical challenge we currently face in our society. So, re-engaging Canadians in democracy, the focus of this evening's presentation by Preston Manning, is one of perhaps the most important challenges facing our society. At a time when voter turnout is at an all-time low, the youth are not terribly engaged in the process, and there is a significant erosion of trust in our major political institutions. People seem to be engaged more in the U.S. primaries than they do in the political processes here in Canada. There are few better persons in this country to talk about these issues than Preston Manning, a man who exemplifies strong commitment to the democratic process. I first met Preston, I was just reminding him, back in Halifax when he was stomping across Canada raising money to form his new political party in those days, and he came to a Rotary Club luncheon that I was a member of. So, as you probably know, he has founded two political parties, served as a member of Parliament from 1993 to 2001, and he was, in fact, with both of those parties, the official opposition in Parliament. He served as the leader of the opposition from 1997 to 2000. And last year he was made a companion of the Order of Canada. I think many of you are aware of his many achievements in terms of publications, in terms of his interviewing on CBC, and so on. Currently a senior fellow of the Fraser Institute and president and CEO of the Manning Centre for Building Democracy. I think, again, many of you all know the Manning Centre is a national not-for-profit organization supporting research, educational and communication initiatives designed to achieve a more democratic society in Canada, but guided by conservative principles. And in fact, the Manning Centre has supported, of course, our Democracy 250 initiative here in Nova Scotia. His new passion is the environment, and he calls himself a green conservative. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Preston Manning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, President Dobbs, for your introduction, and I want to thank the Centre for Ethics for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to speak to you. In looking at some of the other lectures that have been presented, you certainly don't pick superficial subjects. Lectures on trust in science, trust in the media, trust in the judicial process. These are heavy-duty subjects, and it's really a pleasure actually to be asked not to speak on the superficial, but to speak on things that are substantive. So thank you again. The assignment that I've got tonight is to talk about re-engaging Canadians in democracy. And what I'd really like to focus in on is one portion of that, and that is restoring trust in the participants in the political process and the political processes and institutions. Can that be done? Can you restore trust in politicians? How can it be done? And how can you be engaged in that restoration process? Maybe I could spend just a minute on why this is necessary. And I think you know all the answers, that people's trust in the political process, in institutions and politicians has been eroded by scandals, the sponsorship scandal, scenes on television recently of police raiding the Conservative Party headquarters. And this is a small subset of other scandals, the Enron scandal, the WorldCom scandal, just these scandals have the net effect of reducing people's trust in the big institutions, whether it's business or government or whatever it is. The polls show continuing declining confidence in everything from parties to politicians to leaders to candidates to electoral processes to the institutions of Parliament and the legislatures themselves. The declining turnout for elections, a so-called democracy deficit that's not confined to our country but to almost all the Western democracies, 1.2 million Canadians under the age of 25 not voting in the last federal election. The latest turnout in the Alberta provincial election was 41%, 21% in Fort McMurray, a community that's got all kinds of challenges and problems, but people don't see participating in politics as a way to resolve them. And then the way I used to keep track, part of the declining confidence in politicians, I used to keep a file on jokes on politicians, but you notice the negative character of them. Just a weekend ago, I participated there's a bunch of canoers that are celebrating the 200th anniversary of David Thompson going back across and forth the country, and they set out from Rocky Mountain House. They're going to paddle to the lakehead, this, whatever it is, 3,600 kilometers over the summer. But I was standing in the line. I went out with them for the first day. I was standing in the line, and a fellow came up to me and says, what do a river and a politician have in common? So I bit and said, I don't know. He said, they both have a wide mouth and a narrow head. You'll notice the negative connotation. There's the old joke about there's a difference between a dead skunk and a dead politician on the Trans-Canada Highway. You've all heard that one. There's skid marks in front of the skunk. And then the most vicious one that I picked up was in Saskatchewan was how many politicians does it take to grease a combine? 3 or 4 if you put them through slowly. but you'll notice a fairly negative connotation, all of which I think are an indication of people's skepticism and lack of trust in the politicians. So how can we restore Canadians' trust in politicians, which I think is the key to re-engagement in democracy? I want to break my remarks down into 2 categories. First of all, what can we do to make the processes and institutions of politics more trustworthy? Electoral processes, parliament, legislatures. And then secondly, what can we do to make the participants themselves, the politicians themselves, more trustworthy? I actually happen to think we should spend most of our time on the second part of that, because I don't think you can make processes and institutions trustworthy unless the people in those institutions and processes are trustworthy. But let's spend just a couple of minutes on the institution. It may well be that we could restore people's confidence in politics to some degree by making elections more fair. And there's a number of people across the country that are working on electoral reform. Is there some way you could make the election process more attractive to more voters, more fair, more equitable, and so forth? And there are different systems, of course, proposed. The current system is the first-past-the-post system, which does give definitive results and majorities. There's a lot of interest in proportional representation, the single transferable ballot. There's a number of varying changes you could make in the electoral system. Without getting into the merits of these, I do think the best way to come at electoral reform is the process that was used in British Columbia, where they set up this constituent assembly. All the parties have a vested interest in one system or another. If you've won elections under first-past-the-post, you like first-past-the-post. If you're a small party, you've got a better chance under proportional representation. What BC did, I know some of you are familiar with this, was set up a constituent assembly, a citizens' assembly. They actually picked names off the voters list at random and then screened those people to see if they wanted to sit in on this constituent assembly. And that constituent assembly then looked at, should there be a reform to the electoral system in BC? They made a recommendation. The recommendation became the subject of a referendum. In their case, the recommendation was narrowly defeated, although I believe BC is going to try again. They will probably reform their system that way. And my own view on these different systems is if there's an electoral system in which people have more confidence than the one they have now, then adopt it. I'm almost more interested in whether the system, whatever it is, commands people's confidence. Then that is perhaps one way to restore at least some people's confidence or trust in the electoral system. Secondly, we could perhaps reduce people's confidence in politics to some degree by reforming the institutions themselves. Institutional reform. This was something that I was quite involved in with the Reform Party in the early days. For example, 25% of the seats in our parliament are filled by unelected people, and I would argue unaccountable people, the people in the Senate. Is there room for an elected upper chamber? Would that at least increase people's confidence in that part of our parliament? Excessive party discipline in the House of Commons is one of the things that destroys people's confidence in their elected members. People become conscious that their elected member is not free to represent their position or their view on an issue if it conflicts with the party line, or in the case of a government, with the government's position. The simplest reform to change that is to have freer voting, which means doing away with the so-called confidence motion. In most of our legislatures and Parliament, the confidence convention says that if a government loses a vote or an opposition motion is carried, that the government is under some obligation to resign. You could change that. Say the government only resigns when it loses a clear confidence motion in the House, freer voting. And freer voting might, again, increase people's confidence or trust that the person they elect can carry their view into the Parliament of Canada and even into their voting. If you want an illustration of the revitalizing power of free votes, my last month in the Parliament was December 2001. And it was getting close to Christmas, and there's a whole pile of votes end up going through close to Christmas because the members want to get home. It's amazing how the holiday coming up can speed up the business of Parliament. And this one particular night, it was fairly late, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, the bells start to ring for this vote. I go down for the vote, and the first motion on the order paper was a supply bill, which is voting money for the government on a regular basis. These supply bills happen all the time. I asked our House member that was responsible for this, how much was this one worth? He says $6 billion. Most of the members have no idea what the supply bill is, what the dollar figure is, because this is one of these government motions. The government people are for it, the opposition are against it. That's all you got to know. Is it theirs or ours? It's theirs, well, we're against it. If you're on the government side, you're for it. So this $6 billion supply bill sails through the House without a flicker of interest from any member on either side of the House. But the next item on the order paper was a private member's bill, which are freer voting. The parties sometimes don't take position on it, so the members actually have to make up their mind. Am I for this or against it? This particular earth-shaking bill was a motion calling for the government to explain why it had reduced the percentage of strychnine in gopher poison from 5% to 3%. Some prairie member that had a problem with gophers had farmers that were complaining the gopher poison wasn't strong enough, so why had they reduced the strychnine level? So this had got into a private member's bill. It worked its way all the way through, and by golly, it came to a vote in the House. On private members' bills, they go up and down the rows, and it was noticeable that there was a quickening of interest in the House at this gopher bill. And as the members kept standing up for or against it, it was becoming clear that the thing might actually pass. Not only that the opposition members were voting for it, but there was a cheer went up when some Ontario members on the government side got up for it. And soon it was federalists and separatists and French speakers and English speakers and urban members and rural members uniting behind this groundbreaking issue. And when it passed, 134 to 123, there was cheers. One member threw papers in the air. Another jumped over his desk to congratulate Leon Benoit, who was the sponsor of the motion. I voted for the gopher motion myself, but I went away that night saying, what's wrong with this place? when the Gopher bill commands more interest and support than a $6 billion supply motion. And of course the difference was the freer vote. The members actually did have to make up their minds and have some judgment on it. So those are a couple of suggestions on institutional and process reform. But as I said earlier, I think the real challenge is how do we make politicians, or how do we make it even broader than that, how do we make participants in the political process itself more trustworthy? Or how do we get more trustworthy people into public life? Part of my thinking on this was influenced by, I participated in an all-candidate nominating meeting in a town called Whitecourt in the 1993 federal election. It was a riding represented, the member who was the elected member was there, and there was a question period at the end. And a fellow got up for the question period, and he hollered in a loud voice at this elected member, "Why should we vote for you when you won't vote for us?" And he started to list off about 6 issues on which the position of the people in that constituency was this, and the member had voted the other way. And in essence, what he was saying, if you separate out the particular issues, was saying that I will not trust a politician who doesn't trust me. I won't trust a politician who doesn't trust me. And it made the acid test of the trustworthiness of that politician, not his position on electoral reform or institutional change, important as those things were, but does that politician trust me? Why should I trust him if he doesn't trust me? And in this voter's mind, that was actually more important than whether this member was a candidate, was a liberal or a conservative or a social democrat. What he's really asking was, are these candidates small d Democrats? Like, do they believe in us? And I'm not prepared to trust them if they don't trust me. I think it's a valid point. And so the test then for this particular voter become, how do you tell a small d Democrat? How do you tell whether the candidate whose name's on the ballot is someone who trusts you and is therefore deserving of your trust? And there are some simple tests. One is you can't tell by the rhetoric. You ask any candidate for public office in this country, are you a Democrat? Of course, what are they going to say? Of course they are. But so that's not, you've got to probe more deeply. One way of telling is, do they listen more than they talk? If a Democrat, if you trust the public, you will listen hard to what the public is saying to you. You will not disappear right after the meeting. You'll hang around after the meeting because you'll end up, people will say things to you that you listen more than you talk. Do they advocate or support democratic reforms? I always felt one of the good tests was ask a candidate, do you or do you not believe in free voting? It's a good acid test because free voting means you want to represent your constituents' view, even if it conflicts with your own view, or even if it conflicts with your party's view. If push comes to shove, I've taken people that were trying to convince to run for public office, taking them to the House of Commons at night when there's nobody there, and sit them behind the desk, the real thing. So, okay, suppose you were here. And the difficult votes are not the obvious ones. The difficult ones is when your view conflicts with your constituents' view, which conflicts with your party's view. What do you do then? Well, the small d Democrat will lean towards representing the constituents' view. So one way of getting at this question of trust and ascertaining whether you can trust someone is to ascertain how deep their commitment is to small d democracy, not to conservatism, not to liberalism, not to social democracy, important as those are. But are they a small d Democrat or not? And I think if we recruited more small d Democrats into politics, all of the parties, you would perhaps increase the level of confidence of people in those politicians. Now, a second thing that can be done, and this gets into actually the work that I'm doing now through our Manning Center for Building Democracy, is another way to make political people more trustworthy is to provide them with more and better training for effective and responsible political participation. When I got out of Parliament, my wife says I shouldn't use that phrase because it sounds like I was in the penitentiary, but when I left Ottawa, a lot of people ask me, why is it that politicians are losing public confidence? And one of the answers that I gave and still give is that the political parties, and I'm not against political parties. I like political parties. I started 2 of them. I can hardly be against. There's a place for them. If you started with your parliament and legislature with no parties today, within 100 days there would be parties. Because you can't get things through majority legislatures until you get 50% plus one of the members, and as soon as they start clumping together to form 50% plus one, you got the makings of a party. That's how parties started in the old British parliamentary systems. I'm not knocking parties, but the modern political party has essentially become a marketing mechanism for fighting elections. That is the principal job of the modern party. They do very little of their own intellectual capital development, their own idea development, dependent on others, think tanks, policy centers, public intellectuals, suggestions from the public for intellectual capital. And the parties do virtually no training of the people, from door knockers to constituency associations to campaign managers to candidates to elected people to cabinet ministers. There's no service organization in the country that invests less in human resources development than the political parties. And I'm not blaming anybody. When we were in Ottawa, I once posed to our caucus, we had 52 members. I wanted to get I don't know what we would have called him, a human resources development person who would just help us get more out of our 52. But we've got a very limited budget, don't have much money, when the choice came between do we get a human resources guy to try to invest more in our own people to get more out of them, or do we get an assistant campaign manager for Ontario? Like which option do you think won out? I mean, I could have imposed my will, but the party is a mechanism for fighting elections, and so the assistant campaign manager for Ontario is a higher priority than any investment in human resources. I've used this Starbucks analogy. To work for Starbucks, you got to take 20 to 30 hours training to know the difference between a good latte and a bad latte. You can become a lawmaker in the Parliament of Canada, the legislature of Nova Scotia, the legislature of Alberta, without one single hour of training in lawmaking. In what other profession did that happen? I got on an airplane this morning, came from Toronto to here. Suppose I'm sitting there in my seat and the crew is coming in and I happen to hear them talk and say, gee, this is a nice airplane. I've never been in one like this before. Would you stay in your seat? Now, we expect our political people to learn on the job. That's the way it's always been done. How do you learn lawmaking? You learn on the job. But that's becoming increasingly hard to do. Younger members, every single mistake they make, if they're in the public eye, they're in the eye of the media. If they make a mistake, it's on the front pages that night, or their opponents amplify it. So this learning on the job is getting harder and harder. Maybe there was a time when that could be done, but it isn't now. So one of the things that we've done is set up this Center for Building Democracy. I was giving a talk like this to a small group, and somebody, a very generous donor, offered to put up some money to fund a center to provide more training for people getting into the political business, which is what we're doing through the Center for Building Democracy. Our particular emphasis, because of my background and because of the resources that I can draw upon, is basically training people for the more conservative side of the house. But the analysis that I'm giving applies to whatever your political background is. Your party, whatever your party is, its main preoccupation is fighting elections. If it's going to develop intellectual capital, if it's going to develop human capital, if it's going to develop increased communications capacity, increasingly that has to be done outside the party by people sympathetic to the party but not part of the party machinery. Democratic infrastructure. And I suggest these investments in democratic infrastructure is one way to increase the capability and the capacity of people who run for public life, and therefore their ability to command your confidence and your trust. Now let me mention a couple of specific things that we're trying to do. One is set up a school of practical politics, just to teach these simple things like door knocking, like campaign management. But particularly we want to develop an online course for constituency executive associations, electoral district associations. They're not EDAs, they're now called in the federal jurisdiction. You know, these constituency associations. There's about 1,000, for any one party in Canada, there's about 1,000 seats between the federal parliament and all the provincial parliaments. There's 1,000 conservative constituency associations, 1,000 liberal ones, NDP ones. Most of these are made up of 15 to 20 people, volunteers. They're not professionals. This country ought to figure out what it would cost if we ever had to pay the people that volunteer to make the democratic system work. But there's virtually no training for them. And this is starting to become serious. As the electoral laws get more complicated, particularly these laws governing electoral financing, the constituency associations are going to be criminally liable, particularly for how they handle money. So there's an enormous need here to provide more training. And I have to, and the other reason this is important and affects trustworthiness is these constituency associations, as you know in most cases, are the ones that help select the candidate. You don't like the names on the ballot? How did the names get on the ballot? There was a meeting some night at a schoolhouse organized by those 15 to 20 people, and that's how the names got on the ballot. And if we don't like the quality or you don't like the names, those constituency associations have a huge role to play in the recruitment of who gets into public life. And I know of communities in this country where more thought and effort has been put into recruiting their rink manager than their representative with a $225 billion corporation, which is what the government of Canada is. You know, at least for the rink manager, they drew up a job description. What do they want him to do? Lawmaking is one of the things. You don't find one constituency executive in 15 that gives thought to this person's going to be asked to make laws. You know, the rink manager, at least you have a list of qualifications. You got to be able to drive the Zamboni. You got to be able to do this. You can't have an alcohol problem or a drugs abuse problem or a financial problem where your rink gets into trouble. Amazing the people that have go to Ottawa that have got one of those problems, which makes them dysfunctional within a year. There's a lot could be done at that constituency level to get candidates and people for public life, help them prepare for public life that would engage your trust. And so that's the role for a school of politics. Another program that we've got is a seminar program on navigating the faith-political interface. It used to be that voters welcomed candidates with deep religious and moral convictions. They felt that they had a stability to them, worried about the ethical dimensions of politics, maybe more than people that didn't. But that's all changed today. Today, people are scared stiff of candidates with any kind of obvious religious connection. They're afraid of wackos. They're afraid of extremists. They're afraid of that people with deep religious conviction will impose their convictions on that. And these views, some of them are unfair, but some of them come about because of people with religious convictions who conducted themselves that way in the political arena. So we have seminars on navigating the faith-political interface. If you're a faith-oriented person and you want to get into the political arena, maybe you're impelled to get into the political arena because of your faith. It's given you a particular passion for poverty or for healing or on some of these complex moral and ethical issues like abortion, like same-sex marriage. The next one's going to be end-of-life issues, euthanasia, whatever the reason is. What these seminars intend to do is not recruit or try to motivate people with religious conviction to get in the political arena, but say if you are going to get in, there's a way to conduct yourself in such a way that you'll be a credit to your faith community and you'll find allies among your secular people. We use the famous quotation from Jesus when you remember his when he sent his gang out to do public work. The first year in his ministry, he did not send them out to do public work. He did the public work. He was the public face. But after about a year, he started to send them out. But before he sent them out, he gave them a talking to. And the theme of his talk was, if you're going to go out, be wise as serpents and gracious as doves. He did not say, be vicious as snakes and stupid as pigeons. So there's an area. There's a place for people with deep conviction, including religious conviction in politics. We want to raise the ethical tone of a discussion. There's a place for that. But people from that perspective, I come from that perspective, got to learn to conduct ourselves wisely and graciously. And there's skills that we can learn in that area. And we're trying to put on some seminars that may help. We started with basically Christian people, but we've now done one with the Jewish community and one with the Muslim community in Toronto, which is very interesting, a different perspective. Because a secular politician or voter doesn't distinguish between these religious groups. Doesn't matter if you're a person of faith and you screw up in the political arena, the secular guys say that's what happens when you let those religious guys out of their closet. So there's a sort of a commonality regardless of what your faith background is. A third area of training that I think would help is in the United States there are 9 graduate schools in political management. This is not political science, and it's not business management, and it's not public administration. It's political management. It's like for training the chief executive or senior executive in a minister's office, the political guy, not the civil servant. It would be for training an executive of a political party or of an interest group or of a big campaign. It's political management. And we've put on 3 courses, mainly in Ottawa, at a graduate school level in this area. The George Washington Graduate School of Political Management in Washington, D.C. at George Washington University has 32 master's level courses in this area. We just started out with got 3. We can't grant a degree. We can give people a certificate, but we're starting into a negotiation with Carleton University to see if we can't get a graduate school in political management. So people that are serious in having political careers, this is not necessarily electoral careers, can take these courses and increase their skills. And what is one of the major courses on this agenda? Well, one of them is on political ethics. To get these people, can you trust them? If you don't trust, you want to trust your politicians, you've got to trust some of these people that are behind them and supporting them. And that means ethical training, not just for the politicians, but for the managers. And follow this train a little bit further. You maybe have touched on that in one of the earlier lectures. In modern politics is now 90% communication, particularly electronic communications. And so the real test of whether a politician is ethical isn't so much as it was in the old days, are they stealing money under the table? You still want to watch that. But that's not the big ethical test of politicians today. If communications is what they're 90% of what they're about, what is the great ethical test of a communication? Is it true? Is what they're saying true? That's the acid ethical test of somebody whose profession is 90% communication. And this is not an easy thing to even think through, let alone to teach. In our contemporary politics is an adversarial system. If I'm here to present you with some public policy, I'm going to present you basically with one side of it. I've decided that balanced budgets is a good thing. I'm going to give you all the arguments why I think balanced budgets are a good thing. I may touch on the arguments why it's not a good thing, but I'm not a reliable source on that because I don't believe that. And so you have to get that other side from someone else. So the communicators in the political arena are presenting a perspective. And it's not the whole truth. It's one side of the truth. And if you want to get all the perspectives, you have to hear from more people than that. But there's some point and most politicians know this intuitively, but I think we have to get more explicit about this. There's some point beyond which just advocating your position, where the spin morphs into a lie. And there's some point when you're attacking your opponent's position and all the things that are wrong with it where you can go too far, and your spin is now the lie. And I think one of the things that political people today need to be taught is, where is that line? And how do you know when you're getting close to it? And when are you stepping over it? This can be taught. It can be taught by case history, by taking actual examples and say, do you see? Do you feel when you cross the line? And I don't know, some people need this training. I had a young fellow that worked for me for the question period. Of course, you know the name of the game in the question period in the House of Commons is to get on a 10-second clip on the evening news. That's the whole object of that. It has got nothing to do with trying to find out about information. It's trying to ask a provocative question in the most twisted way you can and most unique way you can, so you'll get on the evening news. And the minister and his staff are sitting there lying awake nights trying to figure out how to answer that question in a way so their 10-second gets on the evening news. And I had a young fellow who worked for me. His job was to prepare questions for the parties. All do this. There's a group of people that get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, read through all the papers, look at all the TV stuff from the previous night, and say, what's the nastiest, most provocative question we can ask? And write it down. It goes into an office. They get filtered out. Now we've got 15 or 20 of them. You've got to decide which one you're going to go with. And the leader has to ultimately decide which one he's going to go with. And so this fellow, he was great at coming up with questions, particularly preamble. And I never wanted to embarrass him in front of the rest of the staff, but occasionally I would have to come into my office and say, George, that wasn't his real name, this is a great preamble. By golly, if I said this today in the House, we'd be on the evening news. There's only one thing wrong with this, George. It's not true. The assertions in the preamble are not true. And I swear, this fella, he'd say, well, yeah, but we'd be on the evening news. So there's a huge place. I guess what I'm saying here is I'm talking in the context of this graduate school of political management, whether it's a school of politics, whether it's seminars on the faith-political interface, or whether it's this graduate school in political management for political ethics. It's amazing that political science departments of this country have not had ethics on their agenda until the last couple of years. And it's something that needs to be fixed. You might ask me in the question period, you could spend a lot of time on this communications thing, but how politicians conduct themselves in debate, particularly in all candidate forums. Like in this country, we do not have honest debates. We don't even come close. And there are some things that can be done to fix that, but maybe ask me about that later. Okay, how do we make politicians more trustworthy? One more suggestion. These are more to stimulate your thinking, and I'm sure you'll come back maybe with questions or comments. The third thing I'd suggest for making our political people more trustworthy is to be more trustworthy ourselves as citizens and voters. The ethical tone and trustworthiness of a representative political system rarely rises above the ethical tone and trustworthiness of the society it represents. If we want our political representatives to be more ethical and trustworthy, it's important that business, labor, media, academia, rank and file citizens raise their standards of ethics and trustworthiness as well. When I was younger, I lived in the city of Edmonton that, I guess like your cities, had municipal elections every 3 years. Before the municipal election, I used to send a pollster, or I had some friends that were pollsters, to ask the pollster to go out and ask one question. He asked people, did you vote in the last municipal election? And he would come back with the results. Usually about 50 to 60% of Edmontonians would say, yes, I voted in the last municipal election. But the actual turnout in the last municipal election was 25 to 30%. So in other words, 1 out of 4 voters was lying to the pollster. Okay, this was the ethical standard in the community. So then I'd go to these all-candidate meetings where the candidates were interacting with the voters. And if you waited around long enough, sure enough, in one of the question period, some irate elector would get up and say, "You guys are a bunch of liars. You candidates are a bunch of liars." And I would get to the mic and say, "Well, wait a minute. According to my research here, 1 out of 4 of us is liars. So for our council to be representative, at least we got to have 1 out of 4 of them got to be liars." So the question here tonight is to determine which of these is the liar. Of course, the point I'm trying to make is you can't get a higher, I guess there are exceptional circumstances dependent on leadership, but you can rarely get a higher ethical tone in a representative democratic system from your elected people than is the ethical tone and trustworthiness of the society itself. Ethical people demand ethical laws and lawmakers. And I think that means that we have to give attention to our ethics and trustworthiness as well. Now, in conclusion, I've talked a lot. I always feel guilty about these kinds of talks on the democracy deficit or on trustworthy, because I've talked a lot about the flaws of our democratic system and the lack of trustworthiness of the processes and institutions and even some of the participants. But I don't want to end on that pessimistic note. I want to end by reminding us of the positive, inspirational aspects of democratic participation, notwithstanding all these flaws, so that we don't ever throw the baby out with the bathwater. And when I think of democracy and the freedoms that attend to it, I think of a story that began, according to some of the historians, 27 centuries ago, and probably began around a campfire in one of the Greek frontier settlements, where the combination of the independence of the settlers, the lack of any formal governance structure, and the natural equality of the frontier, where everybody was kind of equal no matter who they came from, somehow ignited the first democratic flame 27 centuries ago. And somehow somebody carried that democratic flame back to the Greek city-states, particularly to Athens, where it miraculously found a home. And Pericles gave his great oration that we are a democracy because the management of our affairs is in the hands of the many and not of the few. But democracy has her enemies: authoritarianism, tyranny, war, and the most insidious one, indifference. And not too many years after, democracy and the bearer of the democratic flame lost in battle. And the bearer of the democratic flame was driven from Greece to wander Europe for centuries. She tried to find a home in the Roman Republic, but there again war and tyranny drove her out. She tried to find a home in the church, but the church preferred theocracy to democracy. She tried to find a home in the palaces of princes and kings, but they preferred oligarchy and monarchy to democracy. But gradually it was the common people who saw her as a friend and an ally. And wherever anyone started to stand up for freedom or the rights of the common people, she stepped out of the shadows and lifted her flickering flame over the signatories of Magna Carta. When Luther nailed his thesis to the church door, when the scholars of the Renaissance started to rediscover the ancient values of democracy and the ancient literature, when downtrodden France revolted, democracy rushed to their side. But in their anger, they seized and abused her, and democracy was more debased than exalted. Eventually, democracy's friends in Britain provided a more secure home for her, and gradually developed institutions and processes by which she was nursed to health and strength. But then, at the urging of her European supporters, the bearer of the democratic flame got on a ship and came to the New World, where she found her most enduring home. statue of a woman holding flame, a harbor in New York City. She spread west and north. And as you're celebrating this year, 250 years ago, October 2nd, in Halifax, the first Democratic Assembly, flawed. No doubt if we knew the biographies of all the people who say, how did these guys ever get elected? But it was that flickering flame that took place here. Even in the 20th century, democracy's never been free from those ancient threats: tyranny, war, authoritarianism, enemies of freedom. But in the 20th century, democracy, instead of fleeing, decided to fight. Fought the Kaiser, fought Hitler and the Nazis, fought Stalin and the Cold War remnants, fought apartheid in South Africa, the caste system in India, and at great cost, democracy triumphed and lived to dance on the Berlin Wall as it crumbled beneath her feet, and to grasp the hand of Nelson Mandela as he emerged from his prison cell into a new daylight. And I guess what I'm saying is that when we identify ourselves as followers and carriers and rekindlers of the democratic flame, when we feel her warmth and govern ourselves by her light, when we employ her freedoms and tools to advance ideas and common interests, when we train in her service and entrust her torch to trustworthy torchbearers, this is the great human drama in which we are participating. And for all its flaws, I cannot think of a grander, more inspiring story of which to be a part. Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Now, I guess the idea is to have a question period, so we can just open for questions. And unlike the question period in the House of Commons, answers will be provided to the questions. Go ahead.
It's on?
Yeah.
Thanks for the plug about Democracy 250. It's true, 250 years ago, parliamentary democracy entered this land through Nova Scotia. The first elected assembly had 22 members, all white, all male, all Protestant, all landowners. So we've come quite a ways, and in comparison to the 2,700 years, it's been an evolution to our advantage. I want to acknowledge the Manning Center for its very active role in the Office of Democracy 250. I know as Chief Justice Michael McDonald here and his stellar efforts, on Prayer on the Management Committee. So we're all in this together, and one of the focuses of attention of Democracy 250 certainly is re-engagement, and it has a broad spectrum to attract first-time voter and youth voters. My question to you has to do with free vote. And when most people vote, they vote their party convictions, their political convictions, as represented through the party that they decide to vote for. Were it to be that there were to be a free vote, you're in a situation then where I would suggest that the vocal minority would have more of a say, or probably even the subjective spin of the media. How would it be possible to have an accurate representation or gauge the constituency through the noise that you're hearing through vested interest parties?
Okay, well, that's a good question. I think I'd answer that in two parts. One thing you've got to be clear on what one means by free votes. And I think, as you know, I don't mean by free votes the members just free to do whatever they please. My view of freer voting is that the member is free to vote the constituents' wishes when those can be determined, even if that conflicts with the party line or maybe even with their personal conviction, which then leads to your question, how do you ascertain the view of your constituents? And I used to have, as a member of Parliament, a kind of list. And this requires thinking in advance because you can't do these things without some time. One way of ascertaining your constituents' views or getting some input on it is to use these simple written surveys through your household. Of course, the responses are biased, but you'll get some feedback. And if you do this often enough, you know who the feedback's coming from. The written surveys are actually best to get to your senior members of the community because they still will write and fill things in and send them back. A second mechanism we would use is a town hall meeting. Now, of course, the town hall meeting attracts the interest groups, but, you get to in Calgary Southwest, we had a town hall meeting once every quarter. You do this year after year after year, you start, certain inputs come that way. You can actually gauge the strength of the interest groups sometimes by how they howl or don't howl at your annual meeting. We used to use a cable, I had a cable station in my network. We did electronic town hall meetings where put a question up and people could respond through the phone. Then I would do periodic scientific surveys of my constituents, a scientifically done sample. And I used to use the scientific survey to calibrate the accuracy of the written surveys, the electronic surveys, and the town hall meetings. And if you do this year after year after year, I suggest that on the big issues, you can get a feel for where your people are at. Now, it won't be 100% accurate, but it'll be pretty close. In my father's time, my father was Premier of Alberta for 25 years, sat in the legislature for 33 years. His era was just when public opinion survey was coming in. And what he used to do was take the questionnaire from the public opinion surveying and have his caucus fill it out in advance. They say, you guys profess to know what the people of Alberta are saying. Tell me how they will fill out this questionnaire. And then he'd collect them all, total them, and then compare them with what actually came in. Now, this was a caucus that was now 20, 25 years old. There was a list of issues on which that caucus was within 3% of what the pollster found. There was another list of issues in which they weren't, where they acted more like an interest group, not a representative group. And he used to argue the trick in political leadership was to know the difference. On this issue, you ask your caucus what your people are thinking, they're probably pretty close. On this issue, you better go look somewhere else. So it's a long answer to that question, but that's maybe one way of getting at that.
Thank you.
Hi, Preston. Pierre, I'm with Fair Nova Scotia.
Okay, yeah.
And we're very interested, as you know, in the issue of voting system reform.
Yeah.
And in terms of citizen engagement, when we see a system where majority governments are elected with less than 40% of the vote, where candidates are elected with a third or less of the vote in their riding, we see obvious problems with citizen engagement. And you spoke to that. You spoke to how we can get more trustworthy democratic institutions. You also spoke to how we can get more trustworthy people in politics. Is there a relationship between the two, I guess, is what I'm asking? Could creating more trustworthy political institutions attract more trustworthy people to politics and vice versa?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think there is that kind of relationship. They feed on each other. You try to recruit candidates for running for public office. One of the reasons it gives, I don't want to have anything to do with it. We used to do questionnaires, the biggest single reason women would give us for not standing for public office rarely had much to do with the platform of the party. It said, we don't like the adversarial system. It destroys relationships, not just relationships between opposition and government, it destroys human relationships. So I think there's a lot of truth in that. Make the institutions and processes more trustworthy, and hopefully that will attract trustworthy people. Now on the electoral system reform, I see the arguments why First Past the Post is there's inequities in that. And I think a case can be made for proportional representation. The way I would like to see the electoral system change, as I mentioned earlier, is to have a citizens' assembly or constituent assembly that is not in the pocket of some political party, because the political parties, no matter how sincere they are, can't be objective on that. You've got a better chance of getting elected under this system than that system. Your people are going to go for that system. So I think that is the way to go at it. And if that you had a constituent assembly in Nova Scotia, and after deliberating on the 3 or 4 alternative systems and looking at what other people have done, a majority came to the view that the best system would be proportional representation. And it went to a referendum with a proper educational campaign, because these referendum are no good without strong educational campaigns, and a majority of those, or sometimes they have a super majority like they had in BC, and voted for that. And people said, that's the system that we have more confidence in than first past the post. I would support that. My one reservation about proportional representation is, quoting another old Greek, Socrates said, know yourself, like know the Canadian people. We Canadians do have difficulty making big decisions. I think we do. Stark choices. We're like the Yogi Berra of philosophy. You come to a fork in the road, take it. That's how we ended up with our system. We took the British parliamentary system and we kind of married it to the American federal system. We said, why can't we do both? And I think you have to face the fact, if we had proportional representation at the federal level, you would not have the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, those of you that are maybe liberal or that side of the House. It would not have got through a PR parliament, in my judgment. And we would not have the free trade agreement, those of you that are conservatives. Those big, stark choices are extremely hard to make. So this would be one of the trade-offs we'd have to make. But that's the process that I would support. And as I say, I'm for the system that people have the most confidence in. That, to me, weighs more heavily than the merits or demerits of the individual system.
Hi, I'm a student here at St. Mary's, taking International Development Studies. I appreciate you coming out here, especially on the theme of the presentation, engaging Canadians in democracy. I think, like you were saying, there's somewhat of a democratic deficit just generally around the world. My question has to do with going on the theme of ethics in politics. It has to do with a particular issue, and that is the North American integration, also known as North American Union, or operationally happening by the Security and Prosperity Partnership. And the reason why I bring this up with regard to ethics is because just being in activism here in Halifax, there's a lot of people who are concerned about what's happening with how our country is being integrated into this continental union with the United States and Mexico. That's one reason why I bring it up. And then the other reason is this whole discussion about how representative and how responsive our government is in Ottawa is, at the very least, not as important, and at the most, completely irrelevant if we have a new continental bureaucratic system that changes regulations, not laws, so it doesn't need to go through the parliamentary system. And it just seems that this whole arrangement, and this goes to your remarks, is something of a suboptimal solution. You have the elite, the business elite, the political and military elite who are pushing this integration, and we have a lot of activists who are saying, hold on, what are we doing here? And then everyone in the middle is left out of the discussion. That's not how you achieve success. You achieve success by bringing people together, by discussing these sorts of things, by building coalitions and moving forward that way, by getting people behind you. That's how we succeed as a country. So, this debate we should be having, it's no surprise. I study economics, so this is what I'm involved with a lot, but the whole world is moving into these regional unions. European Union, Asian Cluster, the African Union, and others. So we should be having this discussion, and this whole evolution by stealth, which is a quote from the SDP documents, doesn't seem like it seems to pose a moral or ethical hazard. I was wondering what your comments were.
Okay, well, that's a huge question. Let me maybe say three things on it. First of all, I agree that the question of Canadian sovereignty and the maintenance of Canadian sovereignty in the face of globalization and continentalism is a subject that ought to be one of free and open and thorough debate. Secondly, I think you have to ascertain as to whether, I guess it comes down to trust, whether the people that are in power, say in the government of Canada, whether it's Liberals or Conservatives or whoever it is, has Canada's national interests at heart in these discussions or not. If you actually believe that they do not, then I don't know what kind of discussion or forum one could have that would remove that concern. I know some of the current players. Stephen Harper was a graduate student at a university when we were trying to find a policy chief. We couldn't afford to pay anybody, so I knew, who could we exploit? Well, graduate students. The university's always So I called up a professor at the University of Calgary and said, who's your brightest graduate student? That's how we got Stephen Harper. I know that Harper is committed to Canada's national interest. The idea that he wouldn't be, to me, is unfathomable. What possible gain is there in not being committed to Canada's national interest? But that would be a thing in that debate you'd have to ascertain. Are what these people doing do they believe it's in the national interest or not? The third thing I'd like to touch on, and I apologize for the length of these replies, but these are substantive questions. I want to come back to this business of having a thorough and open debate in Canada, whether it's on this issue or on environment or healthcare. Why is it we can't have that? Well, I'll tell you one of the reasons. It's a tragedy. One of the endearing characteristics of Canadians is our tolerance of other people's positions, or just our tolerance, moderation. But when a people or an electorate is tolerant and moderate, the quickest, cheapest way to discredit your political opponent in front of that group of people is to position them as extreme. Because that's the worst. If you value moderation and tolerance, if I can convince you that this guy is extreme, that goes right against your grain. And this is what happens in our political debates. And I'll illustrate this with the healthcare debate. I taught a little bit at the University of Toronto, and one night the students there put on a debate between Bob Rae and I, actually on the same subject, on the democracy deficit. Now, both of us are out of office, so we didn't matter. Newspapers weren't there. And Bob and I got talking about, suppose our little debate was occurring during the election campaign, and suppose the question of health care came up. How would we conduct ourselves? How does our system encourage us to conduct ourselves? Well, Bob said, I would get up and I would say, this country needs national health care standards enforced by the federal government, because that's what I believe. And then I said to Bob, and if you said that, I would collapse in my chair and say, Bob here wants to trample on the rights of the provinces by letting the federal government do something that's constitutional. Now, you see what I've done. I've not argued against Bob's position. I've taken Bob's position, moved it to the extreme, and argued against the extreme. And then I get to give my little speech, and I say, I think there's room for public and private delivery, financing, and insurance of health care, which I believe. Bob now falls out of his chair and says, Manning here wants to privatize and Americanize the healthcare system. And so what does the debate become between? Between an American system and a communist system that neither of the proponents on the stage believe in. And the crowd is sitting there saying, what's that? They don't even believe in it, but that's what the debate is about. And that's what happens on environment. You watch on environment. The business guy gets up and says, or say a conservative business guy gets up and says, these environmentalists want to destroy the economy. And the environmentalist gets up and says, these business guys want to destroy the environment. When 95% of the public in the crowd know neither of them wants to destroy either the economy or the environment. And that's the problem we have in debate on healthcare, environment, and I would argue on Canadian sovereignty in a continental context. Now, what can you do about that? There are a couple of things you can do. I've been a chairman on occasion at a meeting when that happened. And what I did was stop the meeting and say, look, these people did not come here with the 1,001 other things that they got to do tonight to listen to this. And if you people will not argue against or for the actual positions you hold, not some extreme, we're going to shut this down, and I'm going to go out there and you'll hear a rant in the media the next day that'll curl your hair. And, you don't get halfway through that with the crowd. And the crowd says that right on. And, of course, the politician starts to get that. They don't like me going to those extremes. But I think unless we do something to change the character of how we conduct national debate, and that's just one little thing, it's not the whole answer, we can't get to that frank and open and transparent discussion that you suggest would be important on this particular issue. Okay, that's a long response to that question.
Mr. Manning?
Yep.
My name is John Dean. I'm the leader of the Electoral Party.
Okay.
And you touched on this evening issues such as electoral reform and institutional reform. Those are things that we are fighting for, but we're on the sidewalk, we're on the doorstep talking to people. Our biggest evil, if you will, or our biggest impediment is that indifference that you talk about. Is there some advice that you can give us on trying to connect with the average person on the street with regards to these issues?
Well, I think what you've said reflects my own experience. Like I'm a great believer in process change and institutional change, and I get excited about it. But unfortunately, 90% of my friends don't. They say like process stuff is boring. These arguments about the electoral systems, this Senate reform and these things, it does not engage the public. So what can one do? I think part of the key, and I'll tie this mainly to youth, but it applies to other segments of the electorate. We that are in the political business say, well, what do we got to do to get them interested in our party, in our candidate, in our program, in our parliament, in our legislature? I was in a meeting where that was discussed, and a young woman said, no, you guys are asking the wrong question. They, in this case she was talking about young people, are interested in certain things. They're just not interested in what you're interested in. So what you got to do is figure out what are they interested in and connect your process, your party, your leader, your platform, whatever, to what they are interested in. And I don't think process reforms or institutional reforms will come as an agenda item by themselves. They'll come, if they come at all, as a means to addressing some interest that people themselves have. And when I apply that to young people, you ask what are the young people's interests. One of them is the environment. You give speeches on a university campus, the two subjects that you'll get a crowd at with young people is environment and global politics. So we got to connect what we're doing to environment. We have to connect what we're doing to global issues. In the United States, no matter what you think of the Republican or Democratic parties, both of them have huge institutes that do nothing but international work, send young people to do democracy building from their perspective in 50 to 60 countries. We got no equivalent to that here. We don't connect to that interest of our young people. If you ask our young people what's their principal communications device today, it isn't the television, the radio, the newspaper. It's the social networking thing. And yet you look at the communications by Elections Canada, 5% of it would be social networking. 95% of it is in a mode that doesn't even touch the under 25 crowd. So I don't know if I'm making myself clear, but I think the key is to identify the interests of those that we think are indifferent and connect our parties, processes, institutions to them rather than trying to draw them in the other direction.
You identified authoritarianism as one of the antagonists of democracy. I think you're quite right. I take it very seriously. I don't know that it's more serious than the other antagonists. But authoritarianism, as I understand it, seeks to undermine and replace democracy, often quite silently rather than question or talk about it as stealth. What authoritarianism does is rule certain topics, certain things out of the political realm and become now the province of the authorities. And I think we see this happening in Canada. I would call both the free trade agreements and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms as authoritarianism by stealth, as taking things out of the political arena and making them subjects for authorities. Other examples, I think the role of the increasing role of the Supreme Court is something to worry about. It hasn't become as bad as the Supreme Court in the United States. We can be thankful about that. Also, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, for instance, the various provincial human rights commissions that set themselves up as authorities are not accountable to anything. One problem is that politicians seem to enjoy this because it takes responsibility off their shoulders. They don't have to make the decisions. They don't have to communicate the problems and discuss the proposed solutions with the electorate. It's now the business of the Canadian Human Rights Commission or whatever the authority is. What do you think we can do to bring these matters back into the political realm and take away from the authorities?
Well, just to confine it to the relation, say, between the judiciary and the legislature, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think better training of legislators is part of the solution to that problem. Certainly the courts are sometimes accused of judicial activism, and I think there are judges that want to be politically active. But on a lot of these issues where the courts, as you point out, have made the decision, it's because the politicians wouldn't. It's particularly on these moral and ethical issues that the politician sees these come and says, oh my gosh, we can't win on that, so let's just leave a hole in whatever statute deals with it. Don't state the intent of the Parliament or the legislature. Then the court will have to decide. And in a way, that's what we did on abortion. That's what we did on same-sex marriage. And I would predict that when this issue of whether to strike the criminal code prohibition against physician-assisted suicide comes up, it'll go the same way. Parliament will find some way to not do it, and the court will be forced to sort it out. Now, I think one way to solve that is for legislators to have a more clear idea of what legislating is. And one of the items on their agenda should be a statute should state the intent of the Parliament. And if it doesn't, then Parliament should deal with it. Members should talk about it. But you won't find one member out of the 20 that's even got a list of what constitutes a good law. I don't mean at the nitty-gritty lawyer level. I mean at the legislator level. Should there be a law at all? Not a bad question to ask. Is it within our jurisdiction? Not a bad question to ask. Does this statute state the intent of Parliament? Does it or doesn't it? What's the cost of this bill? Is it administratively feasible? These are not lawyer questions about the law. These are legislator questions. This can be taught. It can be trained. But we don't do it. And I think that's at least half of that problem that you're talking about, and that's one way to go at it. I refer to when I was a kid, my father said, I want you to read the statutes of Alberta. Talk about indifference. Why on earth would I want to read this? He says, you think these are dry, dusty things. He said, behind each of these bills, there's a story of conflict, of emotion, of human interest. And the legislator's job is to know that story and ask certain questions to whether this law should be here as it is or should be amended or should be struck down. And I've done that for years and years. They can be taught, and I just think we have to get at it, and it would solve at least half that problem that you're talking about. Don't get your kids to read the statutes of Nova Scotia if you're trying to interest them in politics. Yeah.
Mr. Manning, I really appreciated your lecture, and I wanted to sketch a little bit further your discussion on faith. We look at dropping rates of democracy while hand in hand come with dropping rates of weekly church attendance and people who profess religious beliefs. Now, statistics show that the vast majority of Canadians are religious. I'm deeply religious myself. Government is supposed to be an essentially popular enterprise, and most Canadians have religious convictions. What we've been doing in the last 20 years is we've been allowing the secular to come out, and we've been backlighting important religious ideas. And even when people bring religious ideas to the forefront, they're forced to match their language in secularly acceptable ideas. If government is supposed to be essentially popular, should we be promoting some of these personal religious ideas in the political realm the way they truly conceive them?
Well, I believe that there should be more freedom of discussion and that people of faith should be free to express their perspective from a faith perspective in the political arena. But as you say, in the House of Commons, for example, there is a taboo, and it is rigidly enforced on both sides of the House, that you do not speak about your own personal spiritual convictions, nor those of your constituents, except in the most general terms. And there's less, despite the Charter guarantees of freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, the one place where that does not operate is on the spiritual subjects in the House of Commons itself, let alone the broad political arena. And I think that's wrong. But there's a couple of things that have to be done about it. One thing is this: if faith-oriented people are going to speak in the arena, they do have to learn prudence and graciousness. People that can't communicate their spiritual convictions without either going to extremes or implying that they would impose those views on others end up, the secular guys say, that's why we can't open the door to that. So I think that's one thing we that have a faith perspective have got to learn. The second thing in dealing with secular politicians on why you should let this discussion occur, I use two arguments. One is a democratic argument. I take these religious polls, like in Calgary Southwest. 75% of my people say they believe in God or the existence of a universal spirit. If you test how strongly they believe that, this is Calgary Southwest, so there's a lot of oil patch people. They believe that even more strongly than what the price of oil should be. Now that's conviction. They hold some of these spiritual convictions more strongly than they do the political things we run on. So when I'm talking to another politician, I say, as a small d Democrat, you at least ought to acknowledge these convictions. If 70% of your constituency said they believed the moon was made of blue cheese, you would have a speech next week allowing that maybe there was blue cheese on the moon. And then the other argument I use with the less populist politicians is, like in Canada, we have to be told by someone in authority that it's okay to do certain things. And with some of my liberal friends, I take that book on the spirituality of Pierre Trudeau. You know, there's a book, there's been a conference held on that. Trudeau did not surrender his beliefs as a Catholic, particularly as taught by the Jesuits at the school he attended. He appeared to be personally committed to a form of Catholic theology called Catholic personalism. And there's a fair amount of evidence it influenced his position on the dignity of the person that is reflected in a piece of law, including constitutional law, the Charter of Rights and Freedom. And so I say, like, if Trudeau held these views and allowed them to influence his position, surely it's okay, at least in your caucus, to be able to discuss these things. You don't have to agree with them, but at least open the discussion. So I think we need to open the discussion. You can use a democratic argument. You can use the authority of eminent persons arguments, but it's something that should occur.
My name is David Ferguson, and I do appreciate what you said. But my question is, with all the emphasis on improving ethics and integrity in persons and in our own personhood and in government and politicians, the question is, how do we overcome the influence of the lobbyists? We see it big in the States, but it's also alive in Canada. And the ethics of that is quite obvious, but how does one deal with it? An ethical politician, parties deal with an issue, and the party says you vote for them. And your ethics is kind of going up in smoke.
Well, there's a couple of ways I suggest dealing with lobbyists. First of all, I'm not inalterably opposed to lobbyists or interest groups. I think they play a necessary role in our system. They latch on to a particular interest. You have to make a judgment. In your judgment, is this a good interest or a bad interest? But they bring to light a whole bunch of things that otherwise wouldn't come to light. So I'm not against lobbying or interest groups per se. But the first thing I do with lobbyists and interest groups is I calibrate them. Every lobbyist and every interest group, including the good ones, overestimate their influence. They come to you and they say, if you spend $1 billion on this, do you know how many jobs it would create? It would create hundreds of thousands of jobs. I once kept track before a budget cycle in Ottawa of all the interest groups that came to me with the multiplier effect if you gave them $1 billion. The total employment added up to about 45 million. You know, an interest group, by definition, exaggerates its interest. So one of the things you want to do is calibrate. There's a legitimate interest maybe here, but it's not what the interest group says. It's something less. And so that's one thing you can do. The second thing is that on many of these issues, you can get counter lobbyists and counter interest groups. There are always other groups who hold a different view, and you want to make sure that you hear them. Maybe you've encouraged them to speak up. And then I think after you do that, you calibrate the interest, you listen to the counter interest, you have to make a judgment. Is this an interest is this a lobbyist or an interest group that I should allow to influence me? And at least that was sort of my way of dealing with lobbyists and interest groups.
Mr. Manning, you made a really interesting case for politicians or members of parliament or legislatures being a conduit for the wishes of their constituents, for lack of a better term. Where do you see a role for a member being more a leader, to rise above perhaps what their constituents want to do? I think you used to call them the better angels. Because if you're going basically by what you look at in public opinion polls now, we do incarcerate and flow the role for the military group camps. Where do you see a role for those politicians to rise above perhaps what their constituents feel and bring the country to a better place?
Well, my view on that is to the main role of the politician, particularly if you have this respect for people's opinion, is to argue with your own people and to do everything you can to persuade them. You hold these convictions, which are different than theirs, to persuade them that what you're saying is the position that they ought to support. For example, on this question of physician-assisted suicide, when I was a member of Parliament, there was that Sue Rodriguez case. Remember that? A woman that suffered from this terrible Lou Gehrig's disease. She wanted to take her own life. She wanted assistance in doing it. It went all the way through the courts. It was narrowly, her right to end her life with assistance was narrowly denied by a 5-4 decision, as I recall, by the Supreme Court. Now, I don't think the state should be in the business of sanctioning the taking of life. So in my riding in Calgary Southwest, when this came up, it never did get to a motion in front of the Parliament. It did get to the Senate at one point. When I did these surveys and all the rest, I found 60 to 70% of my people felt that there should be some way of physician-assisted suicide. And I would argue with them. I don't support that position. I'm here tonight to persuade 51% of you that we should go the other way. Now, I actually took the position that if, after we've done all this studying, because this went on for months, and that was an issue where you could tell what your people's position was, if you actually want me to vote against that section, I will vote against it. I can't argue for it because I don't believe in your arguments. And I also said to him, if this happens very often, I'm not going to be happy representing you, and you're not going to want me as your representative, so maybe I'll get out of here. Now, the interesting thing that occurred in that debate, if your people think you will defer to their judgment, often they will defer to yours. There's a power in that position, whereas the guy that stands up in front and says, I don't care what you people think, I've made up my mind on this, and this is what I'm going to do, like you get your backs up. In this case, they didn't change their mind, but I took that position. Other members, and I counsel some of our other members, do that. If you can't, because of conscience reasons, vote your people's position, then you should at least tell them that before you get into that situation. These members that keep completely quiet on what their conscience tells them to do, particularly on these contentious abortion, same-sex marriage, whichever one they are, and then only when it comes up to a vote in Parliament they say, well, actually, I can't represent your position because of conscience sake. That's too late. If there's certain things you can't represent your people on, tell them in advance, and then at least you're in a stronger moral position. Okay, that's a huge question. Yeah. It gets into this issue of, I used to do this with our members, stand behind a desk, pretend it's a desk in the Parliament or legislature, and say, to whom does this seat belong? Does it belong to my party? So I vote the way the party line. Does it belong to me, so I vote my own conscience, or does it belong to them? And, of course, the hard question is what do you do when those three positions conflict? But sort it out before you're behind that desk. Don't try to do it afterwards. Okay, Bill.
You made, both in your presentation and your questions, compelling arguments for more freedom of voting by members of the legislature, and also more professional people involved in political action. In the United States, they have both of those things. They have far more free voting, and they have far more political, professionally trained politicians. I think it's also true to say that their Congress is held in even lower esteem than our federal parliament. So do you reconcile those?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I guess my general answer to that is that because our Canadian systems are so much smaller versus those of the United States, that we ought to be able to achieve a higher ethical tone or trustworthiness with some of those reforms than they can in their big system. As far as the efficiency of their Congress, it's very hard to compare our systems because they have the checks and balances system. You can argue that their defects is because the checks and balances don't work. But I'm not sure what really the answer is to that question, except that I think we have to do something about our own institutions, processes, and people. And these things that I've advocated, I think, would make things better than they are now in Canada. Whether in the end they'd be better relative to the United States, I don't know. But I think so because of our smaller, more reformable institutions, processes, and people. That's probably not a very adequate answer, but I'll think of a better one on the way home. That's always the curse. You always think of the best answers on the way home. How are we time-wise? One more. Okay, good. You've been very patient.
Thank you for being here tonight, Mr. Manning. I'm Louise Carver from Dalhousie University. And just last week here, the cartoonist for the Halifax Chronicle Herald, there's been a complaint laid against him before the Provincial Human Rights Commission. And this last complaint in Nova Scotia, as you know, comes on the heels of complaints laid against the Western Standard and against Maclean's magazine. So do you have any comments about the role of human rights commissions in promoting or restricting the quality of democratic dialogue today?
Well, I've tried to stay out of this controversy of whether I think there is a place for human rights legislation and some mechanism for enforcing them. And part of this comes from the more you emphasize democracy and the majoritarian aspects of democracy, at the end of the day, in democracies, the majorities will prevail. The more you have to give attention, how are you going to protect minority rights? All of us, I would argue, majorities have a vested interest in minority rights because we may be in a majority today on this issue, but we'll be a minority on that issue. So in principle, I see a place for constitutional bills of rights and mechanisms to enforce them. I do think that by delegating that to human rights commissions, some of these commissions have gone too far, and it'll be up to the legislature to draw the boundaries more specifically. But in principle, I'm not opposed to the existence of recognition of human rights in law or some mechanism for enforcing them.